When people stop respecting wild animals, things go wrong fast. And in today's episode, we're looking at animal encounters that ended in absolute horror. From a woman who risked everything for a kiss with a cobra, to a man who decided hand-feeding a great white shark was worth the gamble, but met the worst fate possible. It was 14th October 2017, inside a massive private game reserve near the border of Botswana and South Africa, where dry grasslands stretched for miles beneath fading sunlight and isolated dirt roads cut through remote wilderness far from ranger stations. Lucas De La Cruz was 34 and had spent nearly 4 years planning a future with his fiancée, Isabella Santos. Their wedding venue in Cape Town had already been booked for the following spring. What Isabella never realized was that Lucas had discovered her affair months earlier after seeing messages from his employer on her phone. Over time, he confirmed she had secretly been involved with his boss for months. The discovery devastated him emotionally, but exposing the affair threatened both his career and financial stability. Instead, Lucas buried his anger beneath forced normality while resentment quietly grew. By August 2017, Lucas proposed what appeared to be a romantic safari trip before the wedding. Isabella accepted immediately. Throughout the journey, he behaved affectionately and gave no indication he knew about the affair. During a mandatory safety briefing, rangers repeatedly warned tourists never to leave vehicles inside wildlife territory. They explained that bull elephants could become aggressive without warning, and that once an elephant begins a genuine charge, escaping on foot is almost impossible. On the evening of 14th of October 2017, Lucas and Isabella entered a remote self-drive route shortly before sunset. Along one isolated stretch of road, they spotted a solitary bull elephant standing near scattered trees several hundred feet away. The animal appeared calm, occasionally pulling branches from brush, while dust drifted around its legs in the fading light. Lucas stopped the vehicle and they watched quietly for several minutes. Eventually, Isabella mentioned wanting a clearer photograph before the light disappeared. Although reserve rules strictly prohibited leaving vehicles, Lucas casually reassured her the elephant was far enough away to pose no danger, and claimed tourists ignored the rule for photographs all the time. Trusting him completely, Isabella stepped out with her phone and moved a short distance beside the road. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Then, the bull slowly lifted its head and turned toward her. Its ears spread outward as it began moving in her direction with deliberate steps. Nervous, Isabella immediately started backing toward the vehicle. Inside the driver's seat, Lucas remained motionless for several critical seconds as months of humiliation and suppressed anger overwhelmed him. Those few seconds where he sat there and made his decision while she was running and screaming his name. I don't think I'll ever fully get there in my head. The elephant suddenly accelerated into a full charge, covering ground with terrifying speed while dust exploded beneath its weight. Isabella panicked and ran toward the vehicle, screaming for Lucas to help her. Instead of driving toward her immediately, Lucas hesitated and reversed unevenly as the elephant rapidly closed the distance. Isabella stumbled near the roadside gravel only moments before reaching the vehicle. The elephant struck her with enough force to throw her violently aside before crushing her against the ground with its tusks and massive head. The attack caused catastrophic injuries almost instantly, while the elephant continued thrashing the area around her. Fearing the elephant might overturn the vehicle if he stayed nearby, Lucas sped away toward the nearest ranger station. Lucas drives to the nearest ranger outpost, claiming an elephant attacked his fiancée after she exited the vehicle. Rangers immediately organize an emergency response, but she was already dead before they arrived. Investigators later discovered Lucas had known about Isabella's affair for months, giving him a possible motive. Authorities suspected he intentionally encouraged her to leave the vehicle and hesitated once the elephant charged. However, with no witnesses, cameras, or direct evidence proving intent, prosecutors could not pursue homicide charges. The death was officially ruled a fatal safari accident under suspicious circumstances. It was February 22nd, 2015, and the Delta was flooded. Recent rains had pushed water across ground that had been dry for months, softening the banks into unstable mud and extending the reach of seasonal channels in ways that weren't immediately visible from above. The edges of the flood were deceptive, the boundary between bank and water blurred by silt and submerged vegetation that looked solid and wasn't. Sean Hartley, 36, was an Australian national staying at a private bush lodge in the Delta on the final nights of a 2-week trip through southern Africa. He had arrived with serious photographic pornographic intentions, and spent his days on guided drives producing images he was satisfied with. What remained on his list were hippos photographed at night beneath moonlight, and he had identified this as a specific goal before leaving for his final evenings at the lodge. The lodge maintained explicit nighttime protocols. Guests were briefed on arrival and reminded at dinner each evening. Movement outside the accommodation area after dark required an armed escort. Crocodiles had been sighted repeatedly near the seasonal flood channels in the days immediately before Hartley's arrival. The restriction applied to all guests without exception. The protocols at lodges like this one are not bureaucratic overcaution. They are written in response to specific events. Someone read an incident report and added a rule. Sean Hartley walked past that rule in the dark. Security footage captured him leaving the tent area at approximately 10:20 in the evening, carrying his camera, tripod, and headlamp. He moved toward the water. No escort had been arranged. No staff had been notified. Nile crocodiles are ambush predators. They lie motionless beneath the surface or against the underside of a bank shelf, detecting the world through vibration, pressure change, and shadow. A large Nile crocodile in position beneath a bank edge produces no visible surface disturbance. In low light conditions, even at very close range, it is undetectable to a human observer who does not know precisely what to look for. Nile crocodiles in the Okavango reach up to 16 feet in length and weigh over 1,000 pounds. Their bite force ranks among the highest recorded for any living animal. The strike from concealment covers a short distance at a speed that eliminates human reaction time entirely. The follow-on behavior, gripping, rotating, and pulling the target into the water, is designed to drown prey before injury becomes the primary cause of death. People always ask what the worst way to go would be. I never answer that question, but I think about Sean Hartley when they ask it. The saturated bank had converted what would have been firm ground into soft mud that provided no reliable traction. Investigators concluded that Hartley had moved past the designated viewing platform and along the bank toward the waterline, searching for a lower camera angle on the water. Tripod leg impressions placed him well beyond the platform's edge, at a point where the bank dropped gradually into the shallows. At approximately 10:40 in the evening, guests in the nearest accommodation reported hearing splashing, followed immediately by a single short sound. It ended almost immediately. Search teams reached the bank within minutes. A tripod stood in the mud near the water's edge with the camera still mounted. Running from the equipment directly into the shallow water was a clear set of drag marks pressed deep into the silt, wide enough and directional enough to indicate an animal of significant size moving rapidly with purpose. The camera was still on the tripod. Whatever image he was trying to make, he never got it. I've thought about that more than I probably should. Rangers reconstructed the sequence. Hartley had crouched at the water's edge to compose his frame. Crouching at a bank edge places the upper body over the water and reduces the distance between a person and anything lying below the bank shelf. In that posture, the upper body and face sit within striking range of an animal that had been lying motionless directly beneath. The strike came from less than 2 meters. Sean Hartley drowned. The crocodile initiates submersion immediately upon contact, and the rolling behavior that follows is specifically designed to prevent a prey animal from regaining the surface. Recovery teams located the body downstream the following morning, held against submerged vegetation, some distance from the entry point. It was March 14, 2015, at a working ostrich farm on the R328 outside Outshorn in the Western Cape. Vanessa had been married less than a year, trying to build a family that didn't quite want her yet, and she was losing an argument she didn't even know she was having. Vanessa Greer was 34, a secondary school administrator from Bristol, who had married Dale Greer 11 months earlier. The South Africa trip had been her idea, including a last-minute stop at an ostrich farm she booked after seeing a brochure at their guest house. Dale's children, Liam, 11, and Priya, 9, showed little interest, and as the trip grew tense, Vanessa kept pushing harder for everyone to enjoy it. Ostriches in the main enclosure, 7 adults, ranged between 220 and 280 pounds and stood close to 8 feet tall. They have forward-facing kicks powered by legs capable of delivering over 2,000 pounds of force per strike, with a single claw on each foot capable of causing severe and potentially fatal trauma to large animals, and that include us humans. You have to understand that they are not domesticated, they are managed. The guide, a farm employee named Joe, warned the group to stay behind the rope line and avoid approaching or feeding the ostriches through the fence. Vanessa interrupted twice to complain that the rules seemed excessive compared to the close-up photos advertised online. A German family on the tour later said Joe repeated the warning after Vanessa had already stepped past the rope once for a photo and laughed off the correction as overdramatic for birds. Dale quietly pulled her back, and from then on, Joe kept a closer watch on her. The German teenager had been filming parts of the tour on his phone, capturing what happened next. At the third paddock, Vanessa moved to the rope line while the group was clustered near Joe, who was discussing feeding behavior. One adult bird, later identified by farm staff as a female, had separated from the group near the far fence and was moving parallel to the rope line at a slow walk. Vanessa stepped over the rope. Joe immediately raised his voice and stepped forward to order her back, but she was already raising her phone and had crossed fully into the buffer zone. Witnesses said that she justified just taking a picture in an irritated tone before waving Joe off with one hand. Witnesses saw the bird stop walking. It turned its head. Its wings, each spanning close to 6 feet, shifted outward from its body in a distinct posture that farm staff later described as a standard threat display. People heard Joe shouting. The bird covered the remaining 12 feet in under 2 seconds. The first kick connected with her upper chest and left shoulder, and she went down sideways onto the clay. The second kick came as she was falling, striking her lower abdomen before she fully hit the ground. She did not get up. The bird stepped forward and kicked again into her side as she lay on the ground. Dale crossed the rope line and reached her, and the bird turned and kicked him once across the left forearm and hip before Joe drove it back using a long-handled distraction pole. Liam and Priya were still behind the rope. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes later from a clinic on the main road. Vanessa was conscious but unresponsive to questions. She was airlifted to a hospital. Dale was treated on site for a fractured forearm and bruised hip and was discharged that evening. However, Vanessa died at 11:52 p.m. from blunt force internal injuries. The flight back was quiet, filled with administrative tasks, canceling the safari leg, arranging leave from work, and explaining to an 11-year-old why his stepmother wasn't coming home. Honestly, the tragedy was less the bird's violence and more the fact that even in her final moments, she was still arguing alone. It was the afternoon of August 7, 2017, along a remote riverbank inside Katmai National Park, Alaska. The group had been camping in the backcountry for 3 days when they encountered the bear near the water's edge. Stefano Marchetti was 34 years old and worked as an assistant manager for a regional outdoor equipment store in Boise, Idaho. He had grown up camping regularly with his father throughout the Pacific Northwest and considered himself more experienced outdoors than most tourists. He had never encountered a wild grizzly at close range before, but he frequently told friends that large predators generally avoided humans unless people panicked first. In the months before the trip, he had been dealing with mounting financial stress after a breakup and accumulating debt from a failed online business. People who knew him said he had become increasingly defensive whenever others questioned his judgment. The Alaska trip had been planned as a way to clear his head. Throughout the week, he had dismissed bear safety instructions from park staff as rules designed for inexperienced tourists and became visibly annoyed whenever the group stopped to discuss procedures. I've covered enough of these cases to recognize this pattern, and it never gets easier to watch. There's only so many times you can say something to someone who has already decided you don't understand the situation as well as they do. By the time they spotted the bear near the riverbank, witnesses said Stefano already seemed irritated by how cautiously the group was reacting. The grizzly was feeding along the water's edge approximately 90 feet from the group. Park guidelines required hikers to maintain a minimum distance of 300 feet from bears, and to move away slowly if an animal was spotted at close range. Stefano stopped and watched it instead. He told the group the bear had not noticed them and that backing away would only draw attention. One friend quietly suggested they move. Stefano dismissed it. He took several steps closer to get a better look, telling the others that the bear was focused on the river and would ignore them entirely if they stayed calm. The bear raised its head. Grizzly bears detecting humans unexpectedly near a food source will often respond with a defensive charge. Running accelerates that response. The distance closes faster than any person can cover on foot. The bear turned and charged. It covered the ground between them in seconds. Stefano turned and ran, which accelerated the animal's response. The bear reached him before he covered 20 feet and struck him from behind with enough force to knock him off his feet. The attack was brief but concentrated. The bear bit down on the back of his neck and upper shoulder before the group's noise and movement caused it to break off and retreat toward the tree line. The group reached Stefano within seconds. He was conscious but unable to move. Emergency services were contacted immediately, but the remote backcountry location meant evacuation took several hours. Stefano was airlifted to a trauma facility, but did not survive. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as fatal cervical spine injury and hemorrhagic shock resulting from crush trauma and bite injuries to the neck and upper back consistent with a grizzly bear attack. Park authorities confirmed the group had received full bear safety briefings before entering the backcountry. No citations were issued. Investigators attributed the incident to the victim approaching a feeding bear at close range against established safety guidelines. It was July 12, 2015, farther offshore along the Gulf Stream edge, Florida. The Sea Runner had departed the marina early that morning, carrying 4 members of a bachelor party on a private offshore fishing charter. Kevin DeMarco was 34 years old and worked in commercial real estate outside Fort Lauderdale. Friends stated he became overly confident whenever alcohol and attention mixed. The group had started drinking before sunrise, and by the time the boat left the marina, Kevin was treating the trip like a floating nightclub. He jumped between moving benches, tried feeding gulls by hand while the boat was moving, and even joked around with a fillet knife before the captain stopped him. He was the groom. Roy Bennett had 19 years of offshore charter experience. Around noon, he deployed a chum line to draw amberjack to the surface. The fishing improved almost immediately. So did the shark activity. Within 20 minutes, 3 oceanic white-tip sharks were circling behind the boat. Roy told everyone to stay out of the water and explained exactly what species was present. Kevin accused him of exaggerating and insisted the sharks were just big fish. Roy repeated himself clearly. Kevin ignored him. Roy had 19 years on that water. Kevin had been drinking since before sunrise. The craziest part to me is this: Kevin was the one who decided Roy was exaggerating. At 12:47 p.m., Kevin jumped off the stern platform. 2 groomsmen followed immediately. The 4th stayed aboard because he had already seen the sharks. Oceanic whitetips are open water sharks known for aggressively investigating surface disturbances near active chum slicks. Sudden movement and splashing can trigger rapid investigative behavior even before feeding begin. The sharks changed behavior within seconds. One approached Kevin from behind almost immediately. Roy screamed for everyone to get back aboard. The first bite struck Kevin across the lower torso and upper thigh and pulled him partially underwater. A groomsman who reached toward him was bitten across the forearm. Roy threw flotation rings and maneuvered toward the swimmers. The injured groomsman reached the ladder first. The second uninjured friend followed. Kevin did not reach the ladder. The shark returned before Roy could reposition. The second bite caused catastrophic injuries to his left leg and lower abdomen. Roy and a groomsman hauled Kevin onto the stern platform, but he had already lost massive amounts of blood. They used towels and bandages as compression dressings while Roy radioed the Coast Guard and turned back toward Key West. Kevin lost consciousness 20 minutes into the return trip. He was pronounced dead shortly after emergency responders met the vessel at the marina. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as hemorrhagic shock from catastrophic traumatic injuries to the lower torso and left leg consistent with multiple large shark strikes. The injured groomsman survived following emergency surgery in Key West. On April 17, 2015, the East Alligator River in Australia's Northern Territory sat murky and still in the late afternoon heat. That was the day Cassandra Mears stepped off a small tin boat at Cahill's Crossing and walked toward the water's edge with her camera running. Cassie was 29, running a YouTube channel and Instagram page with just under 9,000 followers, built around close encounters with dangerous animals. Before the channel, she had spent several years at a small regional wildlife education center, running presentations on reptiles and birds of prey. She genuinely wanted to make dangerous animals feel less threatening to ordinary people. To push that idea further, she quit and started creating content full-time. The problem was that the videos pulling the most views were always the ones where she was closest to the animal. Every time the gap shrank, the numbers went up. And every time the numbers went up, the gap shrank further. Every upload was a small bet that the next one would be safe too. The odds never changed, only the stakes did. She had spent 4 days filming from a small tin boat along quieter stretches of river south of the main visitor zone. Then, on April 16th, a video close to a juvenile crocodile pulled strong numbers overnight. The next morning, she moved toward Cahill's Crossing, one of the most consistently active crocodile locations in the region, framing the trip publicly as a wildlife observation session. The saltwater crocodile is the largest living reptile on Earth. A fully grown male typically reaches 10 to 13 feet and can weigh between 900 and 1,500 pounds. In tidal river systems, crocodiles may position themselves in shallower margins where prey is more concentrated. They are highly stealthy ambush predators, and in many attacks, the strike is the first moment the target becomes aware of the threat. Cassie stood on the low sandbank with her camera pointed at the water. The crocodile gave no warning and stayed completely hidden just below the surface. In a sudden burst, it surged out of the water and grabbed her. She was pulled into the river almost immediately. Once in the water, it began a powerful twisting motion with its body, a spinning death roll used to control the prey, disorient it, and help drag it under. Within seconds, she was fully submerged. That is what people miss when they hear about moments like this. It does not build. It does not give anyone time to respond. It is over before the person watching has processed what they are seeing. Cassie's body was recovered 36 hours later, nearly 1,000 feet downstream. The cause of death was recorded as traumatic asphyxiation, severe drowning, and crushing injuries to the torso and limbs. The camera recovered at the river's edge was taken by Northern Territory Police as part of a coronial investigation. Under Australian coronial law, footage depicting a fatality cannot be publicly released while the inquest remains open. The recording has never been made available. And what stays with me about this is how it didn't come down to one big mistake. It was a series of small steps that slowly brought a person too close to something that never changed what it was. Each decision felt small in the moment, but the danger was always the same in the background. One moment, everything seems fine, and the next moment it isn't, and by then, it's already too late to fix it. It was September 14, 2018, on Rinca Island in Komodo National Park, Indonesia, and the feeding platform smelled of raw goat and standing heat, the kind of stillness that precedes something permanent. Dimas Santoro was 24 and had spent 4 years around private reptile collections near his home, experience he treated as expertise. Staff at the Rinca site described him as attentive but overly eager, constantly pushing boundaries for content on his TikTok account. He had been volunteering at the feeding site for 11 days, assigned only to document feedings from a marked safe zone behind the barrier under ranger supervision. He was not authorized to participate or handle feeding equipment. Days earlier, he told a colleague that a feeding live stream with a wild Komodo dragon would boost his following. He arrived carrying a tripod, a handheld camera, and an aluminum meat hook pole that was not park issued or approved inside the enclosure zone. I think all of you are familiar with Komodo dragon. They are the largest living lizards on Earth, with adult males on Rinca regularly exceeding 9 feet and 150 pounds. Their mouths carry over 50 bacterial strains, and venom glands produce anticoagulant compounds that prevent blood from clotting. They do not telegraph aggression in obvious ways, but they do display warning behaviors such as hissing, rigid posture, and low tail tension before striking. That morning, the site coordinator noted 2 dragons near the feeding area. Now, according to interviews, Dimas was portrayed as charismatic, and that's probably why they told Dimas and the 2 staff members present to keep the session short and maintain spacing. If that was me, I would have hauled him out of there. Dimas had heard it, and yet, according to the staff, he still made a light comment about being overly careful. Dimas stood at the eastern platform railing, pole extended, lowering goat meat toward the first dragon 8 feet below. A second dragon had entered the frame's peripheral zone 4 minutes in, approaching from behind along the platform base. Staff were present, but focused primarily on the first dragon, and did not maintain continuous visual sweep of the full perimeter. Moments later, Dimas crouched and reached his right hand down to reposition the meat on the hook. The second dragon, still not visible on camera, lunged upward from below the platform edge and clamped its jaws around his right wrist. Komodo teeth are recurved and serrated, designed to hold rather than release. The initial bite drove through the dorsal tendons and into the joint. He pulled his arm back hard. The dragon initially held, then readjusted its grip rather than maintaining a single continuous clamp, pulling with equal force and not fully releasing. Each second of resistance widened the wound. For roughly 30 seconds, he was standing motionless at the railing, arm extended downward at an unnatural angle. A handler reached him within seconds and struck the dragon's mid-body with a pole. It released. However, the bleeding was immediate and heavy, dark, spreading fast across the platform boards. Staff applied direct pressure and began moving him toward the boat dock. A staff member called the Park Emergency Line at 10:31 a.m. The evacuation evacuation boat left Rinca at approximately 10:55. Medical care was reached on Flores Island just under 1 hour later, and for the severity of his injury, that was a fatal window. Demas knew the risk and made a calculated bet that closer proximity would produce better TikTok content. What's frustrating isn't the single moment. It's 11 days of small boundary violations that nobody stopped, each quietly becoming the new baseline. The system around him kept letting the inch slide. That's how these situations build, and exactly why they keep happening. It was February 3rd, 2013. A small traveling circus had stopped outside a community fairground somewhere in the southeast during several days of cold rain and muddy weather. Most of the audience tents were already closed for the night, but backstage crews still moved between the trailers, organizing props, costumes, and animal equipment for the next afternoon's performances. Brian Keswick was 46 years old and had spent most of his adult life working with performing chimpanzees. Unlike the handlers in the earlier stories, Brian worked in much closer physical contact with the animals almost every day. Feeding, grooming, rehearsals, and costume preparation usually happened only a few feet away from the chimp he handled most often. Brian believed routines stayed smoother when the animals saw him as familiar instead of threatening. He treated the chimp more like a difficult co-worker than something truly dangerous. If Dustin chased excitement around the cages, Brian was almost the opposite. He relied heavily on familiarity and routine after spending years around the same animal. Working around chimpanzees came with a completely different kind of risk from the big cats earlier in these stories. Adult male chimps are extremely strong for their size and tend to lash out through grabbing, biting, pulling, and repeated physical force once they become overwhelmed or agitated during close contact situations. The problems that night started during costume preparation behind the trailers. The backstage area had become crowded with folding rack, prop bins, costume containers, and audio equipment stacked beneath the trailer awnings to keep everything out of the rain. Workers kept moving through the narrow walkways, carrying supplies, while crews prepared the animal acts for the next day. Brian brought the chimp into a preparation area beside one of the costume trailers while he adjusted part of the harness used during performances. The chimp already seemed uncomfortable with the fitting and repeatedly pulled at the straps around its shoulders while Brian tried repositioning them. At one point, the chimp suddenly jerked backward hard enough to yank part of the harness loose from Brian's hands. The movement knocked over a folding rack beside them, sending metal poles and costume pieces crashing across the wet pavement. Everything became chaotic after that. The chimp grabbed onto Brian's sleeves and pulled him sideways into the stacked equipment before nearby workers fully realized the situation had turned violent. Brian tried getting back to his feet while the chimp kept grabbing at his arms, shoulders, and head. Unlike the earlier attacks, this one never stayed still for more than a few seconds. Brian and the chimp kept crashing into bins, folding chairs, and costume racks scattered around the preparation area, while workers crowded near the entrance, yelling over each other, trying to figure out how to safely intervene. Several people hesitated once they got close because the attack had become so frantic. Every time Brian tried pulling himself away, the chimp immediately grabbed onto him again while moving around the equipment-strewn pavement outside the trailer. At one point, Brian nearly reached the opening near the trailer lane before the chimp dragged him backward by his jacket and knocked both of them into a stack of plastic prop containers. Eventually, several crew members managed to force the chimp back long enough for others to pull Brian away from the preparation area and onto the gravel beside the trailers. By then, he was barely conscious. Workers used towels and spare costume fabric to try slowing the bleeding around his arms, face, neck, and upper chest, while someone from the crew called for emergency help from the fairground office nearby. Brian died later that night after suffering severe blood loss and major injuries to the face, neck, arms, and upper body during the attack. The case was later ruled an accidental animal handling death caused by close physical contact during backstage costume preparation. For me, Brian's story feels unsettling in a different way because so much of it came from familiarity instead of fear. After hearing stories like this, it's hard not to wonder how much of circus life depended on people convincing themselves everything was still under control. It was June 4th, 2016, in the Okavango Delta of northern Botswana, where the wet season had flooded the flat lowlands and turned the landscape into an intricate maze of shallow channels, reed beds, and lily-covered water that stretched in every direction without a visible horizon. The air was heavy with moisture, and the papyrus along the banks stood thick enough to block any clear view of what moved through it. The Osei family had traveled from London, where they had lived for 12 years after immigrating from Ghana. Father Kweku, 46, was a structural engineer. His wife, Abina, 43, had taken a sabbatical from her nursing career to make the trip. Their eldest son, Derek, 17, was between school years. Their youngest, Nana, 14, had never left Europe before this journey. It was a milestone family trip, a return to the continent, booked through a registered operator with a fully licensed guide. The guided Mokoro excursion was considered among the safer activities available in the Delta. A Mokoro is a traditional dugout canoe, pulled through shallow water by a guide standing at the stern. The family was moving toward a raised island for a lunch stop when Abena pointed toward the bank to watch a pair of birds working through the reeds. The guide slowed. The family leaned to look. Nana, seated at the front of the boat, shifted her weight toward the waterline to see better. In that moment, she was less than 3 feet from the surface. Nile crocodiles are the largest freshwater predators on the African continent. Adult males in the Okavango regularly reach 14 to 16 feet in length and weigh between 1,000 and 1,500 pounds. They are ambush predators of extraordinary patience, capable of holding position just beneath the surface for hours at a time with only their eyes and nostrils showing, features small enough to disappear against floating vegetation. To most observers in a boat, they do not register as animals at all. That invisibility is not incidental. It is the entire hunting strategy. The crocodile had been in the shallows beside the reed bank for an unknown period before the Mokoro arrived. It moved once, a single motion, toward Nana, and the distance between its position and her forearm closed before any reaction could form. It seized her and pulled. The Mokoro rocked violently. Abina reached forward with both hands, grabbing for Nana and pulling against the animal's full weight. The guide drove his pole into the crocodile repeatedly. Kweku lunged forward from the rear of the boat. I think this is the moment most people genuinely cannot picture. A mother pulling one direction and a crocodile pulling the other, with the crocodile registering none of it. Not the pole, not the noise, not the chaos of the rocking boat. It simply held and pulled. That is what a Nile crocodile in an established hold does, and there is almost no external force that interrupts that process once it has fully begun. The crocodile did not release through the resistance. It pulled Abina partially into the water before the overturned Mokoro shifted her position sideways against the grip. In the shallow water, without the depth needed to roll or drag with leverage, the animal's hold became awkward. The guide's sustained strikes, combined with the thrashing surface and the changed body angle, were enough to break the contact. Both Nana and Abina were in the water. Derek pulled his mother back to the overturned hull. Kweku surfaced and swam toward his children's voices. The guide continued to strike the water to drive the animal off. Nana was not recovered alive. Abina sustained injuries to her arm and shoulder, requiring surgery and months of physical rehabilitation. Kweku sustained deep lacerations to both hands from the hull and the struggle. Derek was physically unharmed. Investigators reviewing the incident noted the behavioral signature of the attack: no preliminary circling, no visible surface disturbance, an immediate direct strike from a stationary hold position, consistent with a crocodile that had been waiting rather than pursuing. What stays with me after studying this case is that Nana wasn't doing anything reckless. She leaned forward to look at birds. That was the full extent of it. The crocodile had been measuring the distance long before anyone on that Mokoro knew it was in that channel. It was 18th of September 2018 in an aging apartment complex in Kolkata, where stained ceilings, flickering hallway lights, and rusted stair rails reflected years of neglect. Priya Nair, 32, and had lived there nearly 3 years because it was one of the few places she could still afford after losing her previous job. The building belonged to Rajiv Malhotra, a heavy-set 50-year-old landlord known for intimidating tenants who fell behind on rent. Complaints against him rarely went anywhere because of his municipal connections and relatives within the local police system. After Priya rejected several inappropriate comments from him, Rajiv became openly hostile. He repeatedly shut off power to her apartment without warning, and once entered her unit while she was supposed to be at work. Priya filed complaints with housing authorities and police, but nothing serious happened. Unknown to the rest of the building, Priya secretly kept Snake inside a concealed maintenance room connected to her bathroom behind hidden shelving. Reptiles had fascinated her since childhood, and after briefly working with a licensed reptile rescue service service years earlier, she quietly began supplying rare snakes to illegal collectors. Inside the hidden room sat a locked enclosure containing a highly venomous Indian cobra kept without permits. Shortly after 11 p.m. on 18th of September 2018, Rajiv arrived outside her apartment drunk and furious after shutting off her electricity earlier that day. He pounded on the door, demanding she leave the building by morning. For the first time in months, Priya argued back openly, exhausted by the harassment and intimidation. Terrified during the confrontation, Priya backed toward the concealed storage entrance and pulled the shelving aside. Rajiv froze when he saw cages lining the hidden room beyond the wall. As the shouting escalated, he stumbled aggressively inside the cramped apartment and slammed into the shelving near the entrance. The impact knocked Cobra enclosure from its stand onto the floor, cracking part of the lid loose. The Cobra emerged into the dark apartment. Rajiv panicked and stumbled backward, trying to escape. In the darkness, he knocked over a standing lamp, crashed into stacked furniture, and nearly slipped on broken glass. The apartment had almost no visibility because the electricity remained cut off, leaving only faint streetlight through the curtains. Disoriented and breathing heavily from intoxication and panic, Rajiv reached blindly against the wall while moving toward the entrance. The sudden movement triggered the Cobra's defensive response, and here's the part I could never fully resolve. Did Priya reveal the hidden room, knowing exactly what might happen, or was she simply cornered and acting out of fear? Moments later, the Cobra struck his forearm once before recoiling beneath nearby furniture. Rajiv yelled and grabbed his arm, but initially did not fully understand what had happened amid the confusion. Within minutes, the venom began affecting him. Indian cobras possess powerful neurotoxic venom, capable of causing paralysis and respiratory failure without rapid treatment. Rajiv became increasingly disoriented as the toxins spread. By the time emergency responders arrived, he was unconscious near the apartment doorway, with a visible bite wound on his forearm. Investigators later believed intoxication, panic, and delayed treatment significantly worsened the envenomation before he reached the hospital. He died several hours later from respiratory failure caused by the cobra bite. Prosecutors suspected Priya had intentionally exposed the snake during the confrontation, but could not conclusively prove she planned the death. She was ultimately convicted only for illegal possession of protected wildlife and later disappeared from the city after serving a short prison sentence. It was the evening of March 14, 2016, at a private safari lodge near the edge of a wildlife reserve in South Africa. Dense brush and scattered tree lines surrounded the property. Animals moved through the area regularly after dark, and staff had spent several consecutive nights warning guests that a leopard had been hunting unusually close to the cabins. Adrian Volkov was 41 years old and worked as a senior marketing consultant for a real estate development company in Vancouver, Canada. He had booked the trip after months of exhaustion from constant travel, long work hours, and the recent end of a long-term relationship. During his stay, he spent most of the daytime drives pushing closer to wildlife than guides recommended. That afternoon, a ranger had pulled him back from a designated viewing area after spotting movement in nearby brush. Adrian appeared irritated by the warning and joked at dinner that safari staff treated every rustling bush like an emergency. That evening, lodge employees reminded guests not to walk outside alone after dark. I've thought about why he reached for the flashlight instead of the phone more times than I can count. The warning was specific. The leopard had been seen near the cabins on multiple consecutive nights and had not yet been relocated. Staff explained that leopards moved silently, hunted from concealment, and were especially dangerous once darkness settled across the reserve. Emergency contact numbers were posted inside every cabin. Adrian told people nearby that the warnings were exaggerated, precautions designed to scare tourists into staying inside. Several hours after dark, guests in nearby cabins heard him still awake. The area behind his cabin contained maintenance pathways and trash bins separated from the tree line by only a short stretch of open ground. Scratching and movement began outside at some point during the night. He listened to it for several minutes. Instead of calling lodge security, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside alone. Leopards are among the most capable ambush predators on Earth. They move in near complete silence after dark and remain invisible at extremely close range until the moment of contact. They are built for concealment. Their spotted coats dissolve into brush and shadow in a way that makes detection almost impossible without strong artificial lighting covering a wide area. A leopard that has spent consecutive nights hunting near occupied structures does not retreat from a single flashlight beam. It waits. An employee spotted Adrian moving alone behind the cabins toward the tree line and immediately moved to warn him. The flashlight beam swept slowly across the brush. It paused near the edge of the trees. Then it went still. The leopard came out of the brush without sound. It struck Adrian from behind, seizing the back of his neck in its jaws and driving him into the ground with its full body weight. He screamed once. The animal bit down harder across the cervical region and shook violently before dragging him toward the tree line. The screaming stopped within seconds. Workers rushing toward the area found the flashlight on the ground near the edge of the brush and blood leading into the trees. Lodge security moved all remaining guests indoors and contacted emergency services, while staff attempted to locate Adrian with vehicle lights from a safe distance. He was found at the edge of the tree line. He had sustained severe injuries to his neck, upper back, and shoulders. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner recorded the cause of death as hemorrhagic shock resulting from severe traumatic injuries consistent with a leopard attack, including deep lacerations, crush trauma from bite force applied to the cervical region, and major vascular damage to the neck and upper body. Wildlife authorities confirmed the leopard had been observed near the cabins on multiple nights before the incident, and that relocation attempts had been ongoing at the time of the attack. Lodge staff were found to have issued correct and repeated safety instructions throughout Adrian's stay. No citations were issued against the property. Investigators attributed the incident entirely to a guest leaving a secured structure alone at night in a known active predator zone against explicit instruction. It was July 14, 2016, and the dry season had pulled the color out of everything across the reserve floor. The grass had gone the color of old straw, bleached down to the root by weeks without rain. Heat rose off the cracked earth in visible layers, distorting the tree line at distance and making the horizon shimmer. The air carried the smell of dust, dried dung, and something organic decomposing somewhere out in the grass. Dana and Mark Ellison were Americans, both in their late 30s, visiting South Africa on a self-planned itinerary that combined lodges and independent driving. They had spent time in the days prior consuming online travel content that framed large wildlife reserves as scenic and approachable. Safari presented as something between a nature walk and a well-stocked zoo. Neither had prior safari experience. Neither had engaged a professional guide for this portion of the trip. They had rented a vehicle at the gate and entered the reserve independently, which park regulations permitted under specific conduct rules, but which placed the full weight of behavioral responsibility on them the moment they passed through. I've read a lot of incident reports over the years. The ones that did their research online tend to end the same way. Before entering, they had stopped and purchased raw meat, deli scraps, and packaged food. Footage they recorded themselves and later recovered by investigators made the intent plain. They planned to use the food to draw wildlife close enough for photographs they could not otherwise obtain. This is the part that stays with me. They filmed it themselves. Every step documented, recovered later as evidence against their own judgment. The behavior began early in the afternoon, multiple times across the first several hours. They stopped near areas of scavenger activity and pushed food through partially open windows towards spotted hyenas. Other vehicles in the area observed the conduct and reported it to rangers. Patrols were redirected, but by the time any unit was in a position to intercept, the Ellisons had driven deeper into the reserve along routes that added significant time to any response. Spotted hyenas are not domesticated animals. They are highly intelligent, cooperative predators and scavengers that function within a complex social hierarchy. In an environment where they associate human vehicles with food access, that association does not make them safer. It makes them more confident in approaching. When food competition is introduced, clan behavior intensifies. When one animal moves toward a food source, others follow. Dana and Mark Ellison had spent the afternoon building exactly this dynamic. What I find hardest to explain to people is that the hyenas weren't malfunctioning. They were doing exactly what hyenas do. The Ellisons had simply spent 4 hours teaching them to do it closer and closer. Near dusk, they parked beside a dry drainage channel bordered by tall grass along one of Kruger's interior tracks. The engine was shut off, both doors opened. Both individuals exited the vehicle, directly violating park regulations, prohibiting exit outside of designated areas. They began eating outside. Food scraps accumulated around the vehicle. Getting out of the vehicle is the line. Everything before it is dangerous. Everything after it is a different category of dangerous entirely. The first hyenas arrived cautiously, drawn by smell and prior conditioning around the vehicle. Their numbers grew. Within minutes, several animals were circling at decreasing distances. The Ellisons treated the situation the way someone treats stray dogs near a cafe table, laughing, filming, allowing the animals within a few few meters without retreating. Spotted hyenas have a bite force among the highest recorded for any land carnivore, strong enough to crush large bone. Adult females can exceed 140 pounds. They are built to dismember carcasses and hold ground against lions over contested food. They do not need assistance to be lethal. When one hyena snapped at a bag of meat near Dana's feet, the situation collapsed instantly. Both moved toward the vehicle. Food hit the ground. Shouting began. Multiple hyenas rushed toward the scattered scraps. Mark ran around the vehicle. Running is a direct trigger. A large mammal breaking into sudden motion at close range activates chase behavior in most carnivores, regardless of prior context. Mark Ellison fell on uneven ground at the edge of the drainage channel. He did not get up before the animals reached him. He died from traumatic injuries sustained on the ground, multiple bite wounds to the neck, torso, and limbs, before rangers reached the scene. Dana reached the vehicle and pulled herself inside, but failed to secure a rear door before it swung partially open. The clan had not disengaged. Several animals remained at the vehicle, drawn by the food still scattered around it and the noise still coming from inside. She was 6 inches from surviving. That rear door is the detail I keep coming back to. Rangers reached the vehicle after dark. The engine was still running. Multiple doors were open. Dana Ellison was located several meters from the vehicle. She had exited at some point during the night, possibly through the partially open rear door. She had not survived. Cause of death for both was determined to be traumatic injuries, consistent with spotted hyena attack. I don't tell these stories to assign blame. I tell them because the pattern repeats, and most people don't know it repeats, and some of them are going to be in a reserve next season. October 9th, 2016, South Africa, near the Kruger region. No moon, no wind, just a cloudy sky, and whatever your headlamp could reach. That was the night Marisol Vega stepped out alone to check on an animal she had worked with for months and did not get back in. Marisol was 34, from Bogota, Colombia. She ran a crocodile-focused blog and field footage series called Croc Whisperer Diaries, documenting her Nile crocodile research work to a large online following. Before becoming a full-time creator, she had earned a PhD in herpetology and worked on a Nile crocodile population study through a regional conservation NGO and a private eco-lodge. One animal appeared in her blog more than any other, a female Nile crocodile just over 10 feet long that the team called Limping Lil, named after the way she dragged her left rear leg on land. Marisol had been part of 2 team captures of Lil without incident. Both followed standard multi-handler procedures, with the animal fully restrained before any close contact. I want to stop here for a second, because this is important. Everything described so far is a person doing their job correctly. Team captures, proper restraint, clean record. None of that is the problem. The problem starts the moment she decided to go out alone. In her blog on October 8th, she described Lil as showing the lowest disturbance level of any female in the group. That assessment was based on handling sessions where the animal was fully restrained. Behavior under restraint does not reliably predict how a crocodile responds when free and approached at the water's edge in the dark. That evening, she told her field assistant they would run a spotlight survey before dawn to locate Lil and mark the site for a team capture the following morning. The assistant would manage the vehicle and spotlight from the track. Marisol would log positions from a bank-adjacent point. Bank-adjacent means standing back with clear sightlines. It does not mean closing the distance to an unrestrained animal at the edge of a crocodile lagoon in near total darkness. What bothers me is how small that gap is between what she said she was going to do and what she actually did. She told her assistant one thing. The footprints at the lagoon edge told a different story. That distance between the plan and the decision she made in the dark alone is where this whole story lives. What investigators pieced together the following morning suggested she had moved to the water's edge rather than staying at a setback position. Lil was resting on a low mud flat at the lagoon's margin. The Nile crocodile is the second largest reptile on Earth. A female at just over 10 feet weighs between 300 and 500 pounds, capable of fast, short-distance lunges from resting positions. Their response to close approach does not build gradually. Prior handling under restraint has no bearing on how an unrestrained wild animal responds to proximity in open terrain at night. Based on scene evidence, the attack likely occurred at or near the mudflat's edge. The blood pattern drag marks, and condition of the remains recovered were consistent with a crocodile bite and death roll. The blood loss produced by that kind of attack in that location is not survivable without immediate intervention. There was none. The issue is, those two previous captures gave Marisol real data about Lil's behavior under full restraint. They told her nothing about what Lil would do unrestrained on a mudflat in darkness. The distinction between those two situations is the entire story. The field assistant found her headlamp still lit on the bank, blood across the mud, flat, disturbed soil, and drag marks leading into the water. A search launched at first light recovered partial remains along the lagoon's margins later that day. Investigators concluded the evidence was consistent with a crocodile attack, though the exact sequence could not be reconstructed without witnesses or recording equipment. She had not been carrying a camera. There was nothing to review and nothing to release. Her field notes and blog entries were examined as part of a safety audit of the program's survey protocols. The Eco Lodge faced scrutiny over the absence of documented procedures governing solo exit from vehicles near active water. The strangest part is that her PhD was in herpetology. She knew exactly what Nile crocodiles were capable of. That knowledge did not stop her from walking toward one in the dark. It just made her feel like it was a calculated risk, rather than a blind one. It was July 14th, 2014, on the eastern bank of a channel in the Okavango Delta, Botswana, where a woman who had spent 3 years photographing animals she loved put herself in danger because she refused to believe one of them could hurt her. Maricel Kovac was 38, a secondary school science teacher from Ljubljana who had taken wildlife photography seriously, but never enough for a proper living. She was in the middle of a divorce from a man who ran guided hunts in the Slovenian highlands and had, by multiple accounts from mutual friends, spent their final 2 years together, telling her that her sentimentality about animals was embarrassing, and she fought back by cheating with one of his best friends. I mean, someone who hunts animals versus someone who appreciates them. There's a place for each of them, but definitely not in a marriage. The Botswana trip was self-funded on a tight budget, a solo slot booked into a small group safari running out of Maun. She carried a mid-range DSLR and a 400mm lens she had saved 11 months to buy. Her goal for the trip was a usable frame of a hippo surfacing at close range, something she had told another tourist on the first morning she had wanted for years. Hippopotamus are not aquatic animals in any meaningful behavioral sense. They graze on land at night and use water purely as a thermal refuge and territorial base during the day. A large adult bull can reach 7,700 pounds and move through shallow water at close to 19 miles per hour in a short charge. If you're a fan of the channel, you know they are responsible for more human fatalities annually in Africa than any other large land animal. The tour guide, a man named Deo, who had run Delta routes for 9 years, had identified a disturbance pattern in the water approximately 82 feet upstream before the group disembarked. He directed everyone to the raised viewing platform and told them explicitly not to approach the bank edge. He pointed at the surface disturbance and identified it as a submerged pod, at minimum 2 animals. Maricel then told him he was reading it wrong, that the movement was current related, and that his caution was, in her words, the same reflexive overprotection she got from people who had never actually studied these animals. 2 other tourists on the platform heard this exchange, with additional berating from Maricel that they described as demeaning the man's job. One of them later confirmed that Deo repeated the warning a second time and physically stepped in front of her as she moved toward the descent, but she shoved him multiple times and stepped around him. She removed her sandals at the platform edge and walked into the shallows until the water was just below her knees. The ripple pattern she had been photographing was approximately 59 feet out and moving slowly, though small surface ripples and intermittent snorting breaks in the water had been visible closer to the bank moments earlier, according to the other tourists. Deo was shouting hysterically from the platform, and I don't blame him. He was about to watch another entitled tourist become a statistic under his watch. The bull surfaced with a sudden forward surge, 4 feet from her position. It did not breach dramatically. It rose, which is worse, because there was almost no warning displacement before the mass of it was simply there. Maricel took 1 step backward. The animal opened its mouth and drove into her at water level. She went under in under 3 seconds of contact. The surface churned for roughly 40 seconds. Deo fired a handheld flare from the platform as a deterrent, though it had no behavioral effect at that range. The group retreated from the platform edge in disarray, while Deo continued signaling on the satellite radio. In the chaos, a 61-year-old Dutch tourist named Wim Berency tripped on the platform railing during the retreat, struck his head on the corner bracket, and sustained a fatal traumatic head injury, and was later pronounced dead at the ranger station after evacuation. As for Maricel, recovery teams worked the channel for 2 days for her. Partial remains were recovered on the second day. Crocodile activity and water turbidity made full recovery impossible. Her death was ultimately ruled accidental, but I think it's suicidal. She died because she needed to be right in front of a man she decided was beneath her, and the hippo didn't care about her divorce, or her photography, or her grievances. We call it a Karen death. The entitlement, the shoving, the refusal to hear no, but really, it was just a very stupid way to prove a point that only she was still keeping score on. It was March 14th, 2018, on a scrubland trail outside Windhoek, Namibia, and before the sun had fully cleared the Comus Hochland Ridge, a young TikToker was filming herself, running into something she would not recognize as a death sentence until it was a week too late. Alina Venter was 27, a fitness content creator with a small TikTok following, built almost entirely on trail running footage shot in the semi-desert reserves surrounding the capital. She ran at sunrise because the light was better and the heat had not arrived yet, and she had built a brand around running alone. No crew, no handler, just a chest-mounted camera, and whatever the landscape offered. Her content was disciplined, 6 days a week, every upload tagged with mileage, splits, and whatever wildlife she passed. Apparently she had been running the same 9-mile loop for 3 weeks, long enough to know where the trail narrowed, where the thorn scrub thickened, where animals crossed in the early morning. At approximately 6:20 a.m., 2 miles into her run, her camera footage shows a medium-sized stray dog emerging from the right side of the trail in an uneven, disoriented pattern, drifting offline and pausing between short advances, its head low and movements uncoordinated. It was not startled. It was not fleeing. Alina slowed down and narrated that it was acting strange and that maybe it needed help. Now I've watched so many TikTok to know that she likely thought of saving this dog for content. She kept the camera steady. She did not move off the trail. The dog made several short, unstable advances, briefly circling and reorienting before committing to a sudden lunge and biting into her lower left calf twice in rapid succession. She screamed and kicked it sideways. It turned and bit again near the ankle before a second kick sent it into the brush. The footage shows her looking down at the wound, then back at the camera. Her immediate reaction shifted as the bites registered. She stopped running entirely, stepped backward off the trail edge, and broke filming briefly as the camera dipped and audio cut out. Both bites bled through her sock. She rinsed the wounds with water from her bottle and applied pressure with her hand before assessing the injury again. Instead of continuing the remaining 7 miles, she turned back and began a slow jog walk toward the trailhead, roughly 2 miles away, favoring the injured leg. Feral and free-roaming dogs in this part of Namibia can carry rabies, a virus that disrupts neurological function, strips normal fear responses, and produces confusion, aggression, and unprovoked biting behavior before it kills the host. In southern Africa, dog-mediated rabies remains the primary source of human rabies deaths. A healthy animal avoids confrontation. A rabid one often does not. She did not go to a clinic that day. Instead, she uploaded the clip before noon after cleaning and dressing the wound at home. The following day, she was advised informally by others not to return to the same section of trail and instead did not run the loop alone again. But she later returned briefly while discussing the incident on camera and posted that video too. It's all about content for her. Over the next few days, she even uploaded recovery content showing the healing wounds. It's unbelievable to me that nobody in her comment section appears to have flagged rabies exposure with any real urgency, and if anyone did, it did not reach her. Approximately 5 weeks after the bite, her family brought her to a hospital in Windhoek after reporting sudden confusion, muscle spasm, and behavioral changes. She died in isolation 11 days later. She was 27. Not immediately seeking treatment after a bite from an animal behaving erratically is, objectively, a poor decision. But Alina's gap was not carelessness. It was a genuine failure to understand what she was looking at. But still, get yourself checked if you've been bitten by any wild animal. It was the afternoon of January 9th, 2016, at a marine park along the Queensland coastline. The protected swim zone had opened following the morning net inspection, and temperatures had climbed above 86 degrees. Linda Marsh was 52 years old and lived in Brisbane. Her husband Graham had spent years watching her argue with flight attendants, hotel staff, parking inspectors, and tour guides. Linda believed most safety rules were written for less competent people and rarely thought they applied to her. The protected swim zone had been installed after multiple shark sightings near nearby surf breaks. Floating rope barriers and warning signs clearly told swimmers not to cross outside the enclosure under any circumstances. Linda considered the warnings exaggerated. By noon, the enclosure was packed with families and tourists. Linda complained loudly that the water felt crowded and spent 20 minutes insisting the trip had been pointless. Graham mostly nodded. At approximately 1:40 p.m., Linda swam to the outer rope barrier. The water beyond it appeared calmer and nearly empty. Without speaking to lifeguards, she grabbed the rope with both hands and climbed over. A nearby swimmer told her she was not supposed to go out there. Linda believed she would survive 5 minutes. 5 minutes was the entire calculation. Not whether it was safe, just whether 5 minutes was short enough to get away with it. I'm lost for words. A bull shark estimated at nearly 9 feet had been circling the outer edge of the netting, following baitfish trapped against the current near the barrier. Bull sharks in warm water near a food source become increasingly focused the longer they remain in the area. They attack from below with almost no surface warning. The shark encountered Linda less than 40 feet from the barrier. It struck from below and behind, causing catastrophic injuries to her left leg and pelvic region before releasing. The force spun her partially underwater. Blood spread rapidly around her as the shark disappeared beneath the surface. A jet ski patrol team reached her in under 2 minutes and pulled her back over the rope using a rescue sled. Linda was conscious during part of the rescue, but had suffered massive blood loss. Lifeguards applied tourniquets and emergency compression dressings while waiting for helicopter evacuation. She was airlifted to a university hospital where surgeons attempted emergency vascular reconstruction alongside multiple transfusions. The damage was too severe. Linda Marsh died during surgery that evening. The medical examiner recorded her cause of death as hemorrhagic shock resulting from catastrophic traumatic injuries to the lower body consistent with a large shark strike. Investigators concluded the exclusion system had functioned exactly as intended, and that warning signage exceeded normal safety requirements. It was September 11th, 2017, inside an unfenced wildlife corridor in the Limpopo province of South Africa, where the late dry season had reduced the bush to pale, open ground. The grass was low, the air carried dust and heat, and the afternoon light pressed flat across the land. It looked quiet. It was not. The Mensah family had traveled from Accra, Ghana, for a milestone trip, a combined celebration of a 40th wedding anniversary and the retirement of the family's eldest son from military service. There were 6 of them: Bernard Mensah, 67, the patriarch; his wife, Adwoa, 64; their eldest son, Kofi, 42, the retired soldier; Kofi's younger sister, Efua, 37; Efua's husband, Nana, 39; and the youngest, Kwame, 22, Bernard and Adwoa's last born, fresh out of university. The guide who collected them that morning was not licensed. He operated through informal referral networks, offering prices significantly below what registered operators charged. He owned a vehicle with no radio, no emergency beacon, and no dispatch contact. The family had not asked for credentials. The price had felt like a win. By mid-afternoon, the guide had parked near a dry riverbed, known to concentrate wildlife at dusk. What he had not accounted for was a resident lion pride, 4 adults and 2 subadults, that had expanded its range southward following a territorial shift earlier that season. The pride had grown accustomed to vehicles at distance. They had no tolerance for people on foot. African lions are the second largest big cat on Earth. Adult males in this region exceed 400 pounds and can reach speeds of 35 miles per hour in a burst charge. From a standing start, a lion covers 30 feet in under 2 seconds. The gap between recognition and physical contact for a person standing in open ground is not closable by any meaningful action. At approximately 5:10 in the afternoon, Bernard asked the guide to stop so he could photograph a herd of impala near the riverbank. The guide stopped. Bernard stepped out. Adwoa followed. Kofi moved around the rear of the vehicle. Efua and Nana stepped down together on the passenger side. Kwame remained half in, half out, 1 foot on the running board. A male lion had been lying motionless in a dry channel bed, roughly 65 yards out, fully concealed beneath the scrub. It stood without warning. What followed was not a single strike. It was a coordinated response. The male closed on Kofi and Bernard at the rear of the vehicle. Two females swept wide toward Adwoa and Afua on the opposite side. The guide, from the driver's seat, gunned the engine and pulled the vehicle forward, separating it from the group entirely. Kwame fell back into the cab as the vehicle lurched. He and the guide were the only two not standing on open ground when contact was made. A passing ranger unit, alerted by radio from a licensed safari vehicle approximately 440 yards away, reached the scene within 11 minutes. What they found required warning shots to drive the Pride off. Bernard and Kofi were deceased at the scene. Adwoa, Afua, and Nana were airlifted with critical injuries. Afua did not survive surgery. Adwoa and Nana survived, but sustained injuries that required months of hospitalization and multiple reconstructive procedures. Kwame was physically unharmed. The guide was taken into custody. Investigation confirmed he held no guiding license, no public liability coverage, and no emergency communication equipment. The booking platform through which the family had found him was flagged for operating without operator verification. I think about this case often, and what stays with me is how the math of it was already set before anyone stepped out of that vehicle. 6 people, open ground, dusk, lion territory. That combination doesn't leave much room. The Pride did exactly what a lion pride does. The guide created the conditions, and the family trusted him. That trust was the real failure here, not the lions. August 30th, 2017. Ranthambore National Park, Rajasthan. Monsoon season, sky darkening by early afternoon. That was the day Priya Chandrasekhar stepped out of her hide and walked toward a nest she had spent 12 days convincing herself was safe. Priya was 31, from Mumbai. She had built a growing audience online through wildlife documentaries. Her content was serious and well-researched, and that credibility was exactly what had earned her a Young Explorer grant from a small private conservation foundation to document the maternal behavior of mugger crocodiles. Before the channel, she had produced 2 well-received wildlife short films. She knew the field, and she knew how to present herself within it, but she also had a firm view that muggers were considerably less aggressive than saltwater or Nile crocodiles, particularly around nesting behavior, and she had held that view long enough that it had stopped feeling like an opinion and started feeling like a fact. And that is where everything starts. Not at the nest, not on August 30th, right there. She had made up her mind about that animal before she ever arrived at Ranthambore, and nothing across 12 days of filming gave her a reason to question it. She arrived at Ranthambore in mid-August with filming permits. A female mugger had built a nest in a marshy section of the lake's northern margin. Park staff had marked a safety boundary around the site. Priya set up her hide at the permitted observation point roughly 60 feet from the nest. The footage was workable, but not close enough for the detail she needed. Over the following days, her confidence in the animal's stillness grew alongside her frustration with the distance. For 12 days, she filmed without incident. The female remained consistently present near the nest, sometimes partially submerged, sometimes shifting position on the bank, but never once reacting to Priya's presence at the observation point. On August 29th, Priya noted in her journal that the animal appeared to allow her presence and showed no active defensive behavior. A mugger crocodile, sitting still near its nest for 12 days, is not a habituated animal. It is a nesting female, conserving energy in the final days before hatching. The stillness is not comfort, it is preparation. That afternoon, a rain shower moved through cutting visibility across the area and shifting her camera on its tripod. Priya left the hide to reposition it, and in the reduced visibility, closed to within roughly 30 feet of the nest edge. The nest had been constructed in late July, putting it well into final incubation, the period when maternal reactivity peaks. Think about that for a second. 12 days of correct distance, careful notes, and proper protocol. Then, a rain shower shifts a camera on a tripod, and she walks out to fix it. That's the reason she was standing 30 feet from that nest. Not a bold decision, not a moment of overconfidence. A camera that needed repositioning in the rain. The most ordinary reason imaginable. The mugger crocodile reaches 8 to 10 feet at full adult size and can weigh between 150 and 400 pounds. On land, they are capable of short, explosive bursts of movement. Nesting females are highly defensive and may display warning behaviors such as hissing or head lifting, but in low visibility conditions like heavy rain, these signals can be difficult to detect, and defensive escalation can occur very quickly once a nest is approached. The female charged from the bank. In the rain and low visibility, Priya had no meaningful time to react. The impact knocked her off her feet. The bite caught her across the lower abdomen, compressing major abdominal vessels and soft tissue. She was dragged toward the water. A park ranger on patrol along the northern track noticed the disturbance and radioed for backup. Rangers reached the site within a few minutes. Priya could not be located in the water that evening. Her body was found the following morning, wedged under submerged roots at the lake margin. The cause of death was internal hemorrhage combined with drowning. The camera had been positioned to capture the nest and recorded nothing of the attack. There was nothing to withhold. The Conservation Foundation published an internal safety review after the incident. It was not made public. The nest hatched successfully 11 days later. What kept me wondering about this one is those 12 days. Every day without incident made the next one feel more manageable. 12 days of nothing built the confidence that made her walk toward that nest on day 13. The crocodile was not changing across those 12 days, but Priya was. It was October 18th, 2015. A traveling circus had set up outside a small farming town somewhere in the Midwest, operating from a dusty fairground lot surrounded by gravel roads and open fields. Behind the main tent sat rows of trailers, portable fencing, generators, and animal cages packed tightly together after weeks of non-stop travel. Scott Rosley was 41 years old and had spent most of his adult life working around big cats for small independent circus crews. He handled feeding, transport, rehearsals, and cleanup, basically whatever needed to get done. He was experienced, but also extremely comfortable around the animals, to the point where he sometimes ignored smaller safety steps because nothing bad had happened before. The white tiger he worked with most often had been traveling with the show for years, and Scott was considered the main handler whenever the animal needed to be moved. According to one worker, Scott used to say the animal was easier to read than most people he'd worked with. White tigers are Bengal tigers with a rare color mutation, not a separate species. Adult males can weigh more than 450 pounds and can react aggressively when stressed or cornered. Loud noise, flashing lights, unfamiliar movement, and confined spaces can all affect their behavior, especially during transport or crowded events. Earlier that evening, workers had already been dealing with electrical issues around the main tent. One of the lighting rigs kept flickering during rehearsals, and a few crew members later said they smelled overheating wires backstage before the audience even arrived. Then, midway through the performance, part of the overhead lighting suddenly sparked out. Bright flashes lit up the tent before sections of the power cut off completely. Once the alarm started going off, the crowd rushed toward the exits while backstage crews scrambled to secure the animals. Scott was already used to dealing with stressful situations around the cages, so instead of backing away from the chaos, he moved straight toward it. The tiger had already been pacing hard inside the holding cage before the evacuation began. It kept circling in tight loops, smacking its shoulder against the divider bars and flicking its tail around. Big cats in captivity sometimes develop repetitive stress behavior like that after long transport schedules, and this circus had been moving almost non-stop for weeks. One of the divider latches inside the corridor had not fully locked during the confusion. Scott ended up heading into the transfer corridor alone. The corridor connected the holding cage to the transport trailer. It was narrow, less than 4 feet wide in some spots, with metal walls on both sides and sliding divider gates separating the animal sections. At some point during the evacuation, the backup lights behind the trailers also failed, leaving most of the corridor dim except for a few weak emergency bulbs. Scott entered the corridor carrying a flashlight and moved toward the outer trailer gate to secure it before moving the animal. At some point during the struggle, the flashlight hit the metal wall and dropped onto the floor, leaving most of the corridor nearly dark. The tiger shoved against the divider, hard enough to force part of it open. In that tight corridor, Scott barely had space to react before the animal lunged into the passageway and slammed him into the metal wall. People outside the trailers suddenly heard a loud crash, followed by shouting and heavy banging coming from inside the corridor. Evidence at the scene showed Scott tried pulling himself toward the exit while the tiger kept hold of him near the floor. Deep bite injuries around the neck and shoulder caused severe bleeding very quickly. There were also large claw injuries across his upper chest and back from where the animal pinned him down in the narrow passage. village. Nearby workers tried forcing the divider shut using long metal poles from outside the corridor, but nobody could safely enter while the animal was still moving around inside the passage. By the time they managed to secure the gate, Scott had already lost too much blood. A crew member called for help from the parking area. Responders arrived roughly 20 minutes later after initially driving to the wrong entrance behind the fairgrounds. Investigators later recovered damaged latch hardware, Scott's broken flashlight, and partial trailer camera footage showing the divider shifting seconds before the attack. The final report listed the cause of death as severe blood loss from injuries to the neck and upper body. Several crew members were later interviewed, and partial trailer camera footage from the transfer corridor was reviewed. The death was ultimately ruled an accidental mauling caused by enclosure failure during the evacuation. It was March 14, 2018, on a narrow strip of uninhabited land about 7 miles off the coast of Krabi, Thailand. It was the kind of place where a satellite phone signal is a luxury and a decision made in the wrong second is permanent. Niran Suksawat was 27, a Thai-born TikToker creator based out of Chiang Mai. His inconsistent miniseries, Blind Drop, operated on a simple premise: a sealed crate of unknown origin, sourced from abandoned storage lots, unclaimed cargo, or rural estate clearances, was delivered to a remote location, and Niran would open it on camera, inventory the contents, and attempt to survive for 48 hours, using only what was inside. No pre-screening, no safety net. That was the pitch, and it generated moderate traction on TikTok. Now, to help you visualize this, his previous episodes had featured a rusted military surplus drop in Chiang Rai and a flooded warehouse haul in Nakhon Si Thammarat. I think I would actually watch something like this. The crate for the next episode had been sourced through a third-party broker, a sealed field equipment container logged as unclaimed cargo from a rural government depot in Phang Nga province. It had been sitting in a transit warehouse for an unknown period before delivery. Niran had arranged for the crate to be boat shipped to the island location 2 days before filming. He arrived with a single camera operator named Decha Watana, a handheld stabilizer rig, and 4 liters of water. The arrangement was the same as every other episode, except a hidden variable would take everything down. The broker had not inspected the crate's interior. Neither had the warehouse staff. Decha later told investigators that the crate had a slightly warped lower seal when it arrived on the island. Later, investigators also noted signs of rodent infestation on the crate. The lower seal had sustained recent damage consistent with prior transport handling. Niran began opening the crate at approximately 2:10 p.m. Decha's camera captured the inventory in real time: corroded field tools, 2 canvas bags, a sealed tin container, a folded tarpaulin. Niran reached into the larger canvas bag with his right hand. The bag shifted. A king cobra, which had likely entered the crate during storage and remained concealed in the canvas after becoming accidentally trapped when the container was sealed, struck once at the back of his right hand. King cobras are the longest venomous snakes on Earth, with adults regularly reaching 10 to 13 feet, with rare individuals exceeding 14 feet, and capable of delivering a venom yield per strike that can cause fatal neurotoxic effects in large mammals. Their venom is neurotoxic. It does not destroy tissue at the bite site, but moves systemically, dismantling nerve signal transmission until the diaphragm can no longer contract. Death, when untreated, comes from the inability to breathe. The footage shows him dropping the bag and stepping back hard into the crate's edge, knocking it sideways. Decha briefly hesitated, but kept filming, adjusting his grip as the stabilizer dipped. Niran looked at his hand. The bite marks were small, 2 punctures, barely bleeding. He shook his hand once, then stopped moving for approximately 4 seconds while looking toward the camera operator, who did not immediately speak. And when the severity of the situation sank in, Decha called emergency services. However, the nearest response vessel was 40 minutes out under standard conditions. It arrived in 63 minutes due to sea chop. Needless to say, Niran was non-responsive when they reached him. Death was attributed to respiratory failure, secondary to neurotoxic envenomation, consistent with a king cobra bite. No anti-venom administered prior to death. The time from bite to death is estimated at almost 2 hours. It's deeply unfortunate that Niran's compelling, creative concept, one that many viewers, myself included, would genuinely have watched, ended not because of a calculated risk, but because he was unlucky. In the aftermath, Decha transported his body back to Krabi, where a simple Buddhist ceremony was held at a small mainland temple before. Niran was cremated, as is Thai custom, with his ashes later scattered over the very same stretch of sea that had been too slow to save him. What they filmed never saw the light of day. It was the summer of 17th of July, 2017, in remote wilderness outside Missoula, Montana, where dense forest stretched for hundreds of miles, and grizzly bear encounters had increased across several backcountry regions over the previous 2 years. Hunter McKinney and Bo Hollister had been best friends since high school. Together, they built a successful outdoor equipment company that became well known across the Pacific Northwest. The business represented years of shared work, trust, and ambition between two men who had known each other since they were teenagers. In March 2013, Bo secretly sold the company's proprietary designs and manufacturing specifications to a larger overseas competitor in exchange for millions hidden in offshore accounts. Before the collapse became public, he disappeared without warning. Hunter lost the company, his home, his reputation, and most of the relationships connected to the business. Over time, he isolated himself completely, moving to rural Montana and taking seasonal wilderness jobs that kept him far away from other people. 5 years passed without contact. Then, in July 2017, Bo unexpectedly returned. Older and visibly wealthier, he claimed guilt had haunted him for years and said he wanted forgiveness before settling down and starting a family. Hunter stayed calm and told Bo he had already moved on. Over several days, they drank together in local bars, reminisced about old hiking trips, and spoke about the early years of building the company. Someone showed up after 5 years saying guilt had been eating him alive. Hunter listened to all of it, bought him drinks, talked about the old days, then suggested one last hiking trip. I wonder why Bo even agreed. On the evening of 19th of July, 2017, Hunter suggested one final wilderness trip together, like they used to take in their 20s. Bo agreed, believing the invitation was genuine. Unknown to him, Hunter intentionally chose a remote trail system with documented recent grizzly activity. The night before they left, Hunter secretly drove ahead and scattered cooking grease residue and food scraps around an abandoned campsite they planned to reach the following day, leaving behind strong lingering odors capable of attracting wildlife. The hike began early on 20th of July 2017. Hunter acted relaxed and friendly throughout the first day. By the second afternoon, they reached the abandoned campsite deep in the forest. Hunter told Bo he was going ahead briefly to check the trail. Instead, he quietly left with the emergency radio and most of the shared supplies, continuing down the trail alone. Bo waited for hours as darkness settled across the wilderness. Grizzly bears possess an exceptional sense of smell and aggressively investigate food odors during summer feeding periods before winter hibernation. As night fell, a large grizzly approached the campsite, investigating the scent left around the area. Panicked, Bo attempted to move through the woods away from the campsite. The startled bear reacted aggressively at close range and attacked. The mauling caused catastrophic injuries to his torso, arms, and legs. Bo managed to crawl a short distance away, but eventually collapsed from blood loss and exposure in the darkness. Hunter returned to civilization 2 days later, on 22nd July 2017, and arrived at a ranger station exhausted, claiming he and Bo had separated after an argument during the hike. Search teams later discovered Bo's remains near the abandoned campsite. Investigators became suspicious after uncovering the history of the destroyed business partnership and Hunter's deliberate choice of hiking route. However, because the region was already known for dangerous bear activity and no physical evidence directly connected Hunter to the attack setup, prosecutors could not conclusively prove murder. The case remained unresolved, and Hunter eventually disappeared back into the isolation of the Montana wilderness. It was March 21st, 2018, off the coast of Gons Bay. A vessel departed Kleinby Harbor early that morning for a scheduled great white shark cage diving excursion. Conditions were calm and visibility was good. Todd Hargrove was 51 years old and worked in logistics management outside Denver, Colorado. He had booked the trip after his mother Dolores mentioned during Christmas dinner that she wanted to do something memorable before turning 75. Todd turned that comment into a full adventure vacation within weeks, despite nobody else in the family expressing interest in sharks. Co-workers and relatives described him as someone who assumed that paying for an experience gave him standing to question how it was run. The marine biologist running operations that morning covered the primary rule of the excursion during the safety briefing. No part of the body was to extend outside the cage at any time. Todd asked whether fingers holding a camera counted. Werner confirmed they did. I want to point something out here. He asked that question during the safety briefing and got a direct answer. The first rotation passed without incident. Todd entered the water during the second, alongside his son, Bryce, and 2 other divers. Almost immediately, he started complaining about visibility. The viewing gaps between the cage bars were intentionally narrow. On the port side, however, one repaired section had slightly wider vertical spacing than the rest after part of a weld seam had been replaced the previous season. Todd noticed it within minutes and repeatedly forced himself against that section to improve his view toward the bait line above. Bryce grabbed the back of his wetsuit twice, trying to pull him away, because he was shaking the entire cage. The marine biologist later identified the approaching shark as a male measuring roughly 15 feet that had been observed regularly in the area. Todd had managed to wedge part of his right shoulder and the side of his head beyond the plane of the bars, seconds before the animal arrived. Sudden movement close to an active bait line can trigger rapid investigatory lunges from great whites, especially in heavily stimulated feeding conditions. The shark surged upward toward the disturbance near the bait line and clamped onto the exposed area before immediately thrashing away from the cage. The impact slammed the entire structure sideways without warning. Bryce wasn't braced for it. His head whipped directly into one of the lower steel bars, hard enough to shatter his dive mask against the frame underwater. One of the other divers later said the sound carried through the cage even beneath the surface. Bryce immediately went limp for a moment after the collision, before instinctively grabbing the side rail. Blood spread through the water around his face as the cage continued rocking beneath the surface. Crew members above heard shouting underwater and began raising the platform while Werner ordered the bait line cut immediately. Todd collapsed backward into the cage, bleeding heavily and showing no purposeful movement after the strike. Bryce surfaced dazed and disoriented, struggling to stay upright, while another diver held onto his harness during the lift. By the time the platform cleared the surface, blood was pouring from deep cuts around Bryce's nose and right eye caused by the shattered mask and impact against the steel frame. The collision had also fractured part of his orbital socket and cheekbone. Several passengers initially believed he had been bitten too. Todd Hargrove was pronounced dead before the vessel reached shore. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as catastrophic traumatic injuries to the head and upper body, consistent with a large shark bite at close range. Bryce survived after emergency surgery in Cape Town and later required reconstructive procedures to repair fractures around his eye. He also suffered a severe concussion from the underwater impact. Investigators concluded the equipment had functioned properly and that the fatality resulted primarily from repeated violation of safety instructions. The widened repair section was flagged as a contributing factor during the review. It was June 30th, 2014, and the migration had reached the Mara River at peak density. The river ran brown and fast, carrying silt and the smell of deep water. Wildebeest were stacked along the far bank in numbers that made the ground appear to move. Crocodiles held position mid-channel, partially submerged, waiting. Along the near bank, hippos floated with most of their mass below the surface, just the broad curve of their backs and the flat planes of their heads visible above the waterline. Rangers had been issuing briefings at the site since morning. The instructions covered a hazard not visible from the barrier. Hippos move between grazing ground and deeper water continuously throughout the day, using routes along the shoreline screened by reeds and tall grass. Those routes pass through areas that look, from the platform, like empty bank. They are not empty. Thomas Brower, 29, was a German national traveling independently through East Africa. He had identified the crossing as the centerpiece of his itinerary and arrived at the viewing platform that morning with a phone and a specific image in mind, himself in the foreground, the crossing behind him. He spotted a hippo resting near the reeds a few meters from the bank. The animal was still. He interpreted stillness as calm. This is the misreading that runs through nearly every story in this collection. Stillness is not calm. Stillness is an animal that has made a decision and is waiting. A resting hippopotamus is not a relaxed animal. Common hippopotamuses are the third largest land mammals on the planet. Large adult males exceed 3,000 pounds. On land, across short distances, they reach speeds approaching 20 miles per hour. Their canine teeth reach lengths of 20 inches, and their jaw generates enough force to bisect a small watercraft. They do not issue extended warnings before territorial charges. Brower stepped over the viewing barrier and moved down the bank slope. phone raised, positioning himself with the migration crossing behind him in the frame. Witnesses at the platform could see what he could not from his lower position. He had placed himself directly across a hippo transit route between the resting animal and its access point to deeper water. The witnesses on the platform could see it. They were shouting. He couldn't hear them, or didn't register what they were saying, or both. That gap between what is visible from above and what a person can perceive at ground level is where most of these incidents live. The hippo surfaced fully and turned toward the bank. Brower paused rather than retreating immediately. The animal launched a territorial charge up the muddy slope. He attempted to run uphill toward the barrier. His footing gave way on the wet mud, and he went down near the lower bank. The hippo was already past the point where the distance or the incline would slow it. From the moment the hippo committed to the charge to the point of contact, witnesses estimated fewer than 30 seconds. Thomas Brower died from catastrophic crush injuries and internal hemorrhage. It was August 14th, 2014, on the Victoria Nile inside Murchison Falls National Park, Uganda, where the river flattens into wide channels between shifting sandbar shelves, and the afternoon had gone quiet, in the way the guides knew better than the tourists ever would. Elise Hartman was 36, a freelance regulatory consultant from Hamburg who had built a professional identity around identifying institutional failures. She traveled frequently, documented everything, and had a reputation among colleagues for pushing back against authority when she believed protocol was being applied arbitrarily. She had booked a 5-day safari through a licensed Kampala-based operator, the Nile stretch being the second day. Her stated goal, mentioned to at least 2 other passengers the night before at the lodge, was specifically to witness the crocodile behavior in the wild, not in a sanctuary. The Nile crocodile, adults regularly reaching up to 16 feet and exceeding 2,000 pounds in large dominant specimens, does not chase. It holds still in shallow water near exposed shoreline, often fully submerged except for the eyes, and waits for something to enter the strike zone. And of course, you already know their signature death roll. That August was peak nesting season, and females had been confirmed within 200 meters of the primary boat channel for 2 consecutive weeks prior. The guide had received a radio advisory that morning warning all river operators to avoid unscheduled passenger disembarkation along the central sandbar corridor due to confirmed nesting activity. He relayed this to the group at departure. At approximately 2:20 p.m., Elise began complaining of nausea and cramps, demanding the boat stop so she could stand on solid ground. The guide declined, citing the advisory directly, and maintained a strict no disembarkation safety posture in line with park protocol. She escalated. She accused the guide of fabricating the restriction to cut the excursion short. The argument lasted approximately 9 minutes. At 2:31 p.m., Elise stepped off the bow onto the sandbar unassisted while the guide was repositioning and a second crew member was at the rear engine. She landed in approximately 4 inches of water at the bar's edge. She had been standing there no more than a few seconds, roughly 6 to 8 seconds by witness estimation. The crocodile came from her left, out of water that appeared no deeper than her ankles. There was no warning sound. Witnesses described the initial movement as a white spray and a single heavy impact. The animal's jaws closed across her left thigh and lower hip. The force of the strike knocked her sideways and partially into the deeper channel adjacent to the bar. For approximately a brief moment lasting only a few seconds, she remained visible above the waterline, upper body twisted, one arm extended toward the surface. Then the crocodile rolled. A death roll in shallow water generates enough rotational force to cause catastrophic injury. This time, she went under. The guide immediately throttled the engine, shouted warnings, and radioed river patrol while maneuvering the vessel away from the sandbar edge. The animal did not resurface in that location. The river absorbed visibility rapidly, with strong current and sediment disturbance reducing surface clarity within seconds of the initial strike. A patrol vessel and wildlife unit arrived on site at approximately 30 minutes after contact. Full remains were not recovered. Death ruled accidental, with notation of victim-initiated departure from vessel against direct operator instruction during an active wildlife advisory. Authorities updated river access enforcement protocols within 60 days. No public statement was issued. What makes this case genuinely hard to process isn't that the risk wasn't communicated. It was communicated clearly, professionally, and more than once. Elise made a calculation that her own judgment outweighed the guide's, stepped onto that sandbar to prove a point, and the river settled it in under 10 seconds. It was July 3rd, 2014. A small traveling circus had stopped beside an old highway rest area somewhere in the south, setting up on a dry gravel lot surrounded by empty service roads and open grass fields. The animal cages sat directly behind the main tent under the afternoon heat, and even by sunset, the temperature was still sitting around 94 degrees. Alan Noren was 38 years old and had worked with lions for most of his adult life. He moved between small touring circuses for years, usually taking handling jobs nobody else wanted. Alan had a habit of forcing routines whenever animals stopped cooperating, especially during rehearsals or feeding. He hated slowing things down for safety checks and got irritated easily when performances fell behind schedule. Alan believed difficult animals needed to be pushed through bad behavior instead of worked around. Over time, frustration started shaping the way he handled problems around the cages. Deep down, Alan saw every difficult animal as something he needed to prove himself against. The more unpredictable they became, the harder he pushed himself to stay in control. Adult male lions can weigh over 500 pounds and are built for short bursts of speed and power rather than long movement. Even in captivity, they remain highly territorial animals and rely heavily on body language, eye contact, and physical positioning during interactions with handlers. A delayed supply truck pushed feeding back for hours, leaving one of the lions restless and pacing around the enclosure through most of the afternoon heat. Even with all that going on, Alan kept preparing for the show like normal. A little before sunset, he entered the holding enclosure, carrying a feeding bucket and a short handling stick used during rehearsals. Another worker stayed outside, nearby stacking equipment cases, but Alan handled the enclosure alone. The holding cage was small and temporary, built with chain fencing and a sliding divider gate connected to the trailer behind it. Years of working around lions had made Alan unusually comfortable inside spaces most people would avoid completely. At first, the animal stayed near the back section watching him. Alan set the bucket near the gate and tried guiding the lion toward the divider before feeding, but the animal ignored the commands and kept pacing along the fence instead. Alan grew frustrated and stepped closer, striking the ground with the handling stick to force the animal back. The pacing only became faster, and the lion's tail started twitching sharply while it circled near the fencing. Then, the animal suddenly stopped moving altogether. For a second, everything inside the enclosure went still. The lion lunged across the cage almost immediately afterward and slammed Alan sideways into the chain fencing hard enough to shake the entire panel. Workers outside heard the metal snap loudly before the shouting started. Alan tried getting back up, but the lion hit him again before he could reach the gate. The animal dragged him down onto the gravel and bit into his torso while pinning him beneath its front weight. Dirt and rocks kicked across the enclosure while Alan tried pulling himself toward the fence using one arm. The worker outside grabbed a metal pole and started striking the fencing while another crew member rushed over carrying a fire extinguisher. They sprayed through the chain links trying to force the lion backward, but the enclosure was too cramped for anyone to safely enter. At one point, the lion released its grip briefly, and Alan tried crawling toward the side gate. Before he could reach it, the animal lunged again and dragged him back across the gravel. By the time workers finally managed to separate the lion behind the rear divider, Alan had already lost a dangerous amount of blood. Large injuries across his stomach and chest were bleeding heavily onto the gravel floor near the fencing. Responders had trouble finding the correct access road behind the circus lot and arrived roughly 20 minutes later. Alan was still lying beside the fence when help finally reached the cage area. He died at the scene shortly afterward from severe blood loss and internal injuries caused by the attack. In the aftermath, feeding buckets and bent sections of chain fencing still remained scattered across the gravel where the struggle had started earlier that evening. Investigators later questioned several circus workers about the delayed feeding schedule, extreme heat, and handling decisions leading up to the attack. The death was ultimately ruled an accidental animal handling incident, and the Lion Act was temporarily suspended afterward. It was October 3rd, 2018, in a third-floor apartment on Ulica Positano in Sofia, Bulgaria, where TikTok livestream viewers were about to watch a preventable death unfold through a phone screen. Mira Nikolova worked days at a print shop and streamed on TikTok with exotic reptile content late at night when her numbers were highest. I think it's worth noting that she had no formal training, no handling license, and no legal permit for any of the animals in her apartment, which had already drawn prior attention from local animal control complaints. Additionally, her reputation was built on proximity, opening enclosures on camera, moving animals by hand, responding to viewer pressure with the kind of ease that reads as expertise to anyone who doesn't know the difference. Her centerpiece was a black mamba, which was believed to be sourced through an informal exotic animal trading network operating across Eastern Europe. Now apparently, streams featuring it consistently pulled 2 to 3 times her average viewership. Black mambas are named for the ink black interior of their open mouth, not their scales, which are olive gray. Adults reach 8 to 9 feet and carry a neurotoxic venom that, without treatment, can kill an adult human in under 45 minutes. They are reactive animals that respond to enclosure stress and sudden exposure with no readable warning, and boy did Mira hit all the check marks. Roughly 40 minutes into the stream, she opened the enclosure to reposition the animal closer to the front panel for better lighting. The mamba struck her right hand before her arm had fully entered the space. She pulled back and held the hand against her chest. Now here's where it gets crazy. She told the stream it might be a dry bite, 2 small puncture marks, minor bleeding at the entry points. Additionally, she said that she'll call emergency services later and that she got time before symptoms get serious. And sure enough, within minutes, her speech began to slow, enough that multiple viewers clipped the timestamp. Moments later, she was seated against the wall beneath the terrariums, both hands trembling with a fine, sustained irregularity visible on the wide-angle feed. She attempted to stand twice. Both attempts ended the same way, a slow descent back down the wall, not a drop, but a coordination failure, each movement slightly less controlled than the last. Salivation was visibly increasing. Her breathing became audible through the microphone. Each inhale slightly incomplete, each exhale slightly longer, and 50 minutes later, she was on the floor, back to the wall, legs extended. The stream was still running. Viewers contacted emergency services in Sofia. Confirming the address took time. She had never disclosed her location publicly, with several callers only able to provide partial identifiers from the live stream overlay rather than a verified physical address. The landlord was reached separately. Emergency response arrived over an hour after the bite. That was way too late. She had died minutes before. Coroner findings recorded acute respiratory failure, secondary to neurotoxic envenomation, consistent with black mamba bite, with neuromuscular paralysis as the primary mechanism. Time from bite to death was estimated at under 55 minutes. No antivenom was administered prior to cardiac arrest. Local authorities later seized the apartment and confirmed multiple unlicensed exotic reptiles were being kept in unsafe conditions, prompting an investigation into illegal wildlife trafficking channels in the region. After multiple flags, the platform took down the video. In my opinion, Mira understood the risk better than she let on. What she never accounted for was the difference between knowing something is dangerous and actually believing it will happen to you. That gap closed in under an hour, on camera, while thousands of people watched, and almost nobody moved fast enough to matter. It was March 3rd, 2018, on an isolated stretch of river in northern Queensland, Australia, beside remote wetlands known for crocodile activity during certain seasons. The area was sparsely populated, with narrow river channels used mostly by fishermen and nearby landowners. Zoe Caldwell was 34 years old and trying to rebuild her life after a brutal divorce. Her ex-husband, Ezra Caldwell, had used expensive lawyers during the custody battle over their 8-year-old daughter and accused Zoe of instability and reckless behavior throughout the proceeding. The allegations damaged her reputation, cost her friendships, and helped Ezra gain primary custody. By the end of the divorce, Zoe had lost her home, most of her savings to legal fees, and nearly all contact with the social circle they once shared. The only major asset still connecting them was a neglected riverside property jointly owned during the marriage. Developers had recently shown interest in buying the land as tourism projects slowly expanded through northern Queensland. Ezra repeatedly pressured Zoe to sign away her remaining ownership share so the sale could move forward. Friends and relatives later confirmed their relationship had become openly hostile, especially regarding custody and money. And I want you to understand what Zoe had already lost before that day even started. Her daughter, her home, her savings. The only thing she had left was that property. On the morning of March 3rd, they traveled together to inspect the property before final paperwork could proceed. Witnesses later recalled visible tension between them before they even left town. Throughout the day, they argued repeatedly about their daughter, the divorce, and the property sale. To reach the main road before dark, they used a small aluminum motorboat kept near the property for crossing the river channels. Investigators later described the boat as old, unstable, and poorly maintained. Near sunset, the engine began sputtering and eventually stalled while they drifted through a narrow section of river bordered by reeds and mangroves. As Ezra attempted to restart the motor, the argument escalated again. Zoe later claimed Ezra became aggressive and grabbed her arm during the confrontation. Investigators documented bruising consistent with a forceful grip, though they could not determine exactly when it happened. The boat rocked sharply as Ezra shifted his weight near the edge while pulling the starter cord. Zoe said she panicked when he grabbed her and instinctively shoved him away to free herself. Ezra lost balance and fell backward into the river. The splash triggered immediate movement nearby. Saltwater crocodiles are ambush predators, known to investigate violent disturbances in the water, especially near dusk. Ezra surfaced, shouting and trying to grab the side of the boat before a large crocodile lunged from the water and clamped onto his leg. Zoe later told investigators she heard him scream once before the crocodile rolled violently and dragged him beneath the surface. For several seconds, the water churned with mud and foam before going still again. Ezra surfaced only once more, briefly screaming for help before disappearing under the water entirely. His body was recovered downstream nearly 2 days later, with injuries consistent with a crocodile attack. Zoe returned alone and contacted authorities in a visibly distressed state. Investigators initially treated the death as a tragic accident involving dangerous wildlife and the failing boat. Suspicion grew after detectives uncovered the couple's vicious custody dispute, financial conflicts, and inconsistencies in Zoe's timeline of events. Despite widespread rumors, investigators never found enough evidence to prove intentional murder. No witnesses saw the fall. Forensic evidence on the boat proved inconclusive, and prosecutors could not disprove Zoe's claim that she reacted instinctively during a struggle. No charges were ever filed. Months later, Zoe attended Ezra's burial beside their daughter, while whispers spread quietly through the crowd. Officially, it remained a boating accident followed by a crocodile attack. Unofficially, many believed Ezra Caldwell had not simply fallen into that river by chance. It was November 28, 2013, and the night in the Sabi sand had come down fast and hard. One moment the bush was visible in the last orange of dusk, and the next it was a wall of dark beyond the reach of the convoy's spotlights. The vehicle beams cut forward across the track and caught reflective eyes in the grass at the edges. The leopard had dragged an impala carcass beneath thorn brush, roughly 20 meters from the track. The spotlights picked up its eyes first, two fixed amber points in the dark, then its body, as the light caught the rosette pattern along its flank. Julien Marceau, 44, was a French national and serious wildlife photographer on his third trip to southern Africa. He was part of an organized night game drive, operating under a licensed field guide. The guides briefed all passengers before the convoy stopped. Leopards are defensively aggressive around active kills in a way that distinguishes them from most other large predators. Flash photography at close range near a feeding leopard had a documented history of triggering defensive attacks. The prohibition was not a preference. It was a condition of the stop. That sentence, "it was a condition of the stop," is doing a lot of work. What it means is, if you use flash, we leave. What it apparently did not mean to Julien Marceau was, if you use flash, we leave. Marceau continued using flash. Leopards can reach close to 200 pounds in a large male. They are arguably the most explosive of the African big cats at short range. A leopard that has made a kill and settled over it has committed its full predatory cycle to that resource. When it perceives a threat at close range, retreating means abandoning the kill. The leopard's response to the repeated flash was sequential and visible. Ears flat against the skull, the carcass repositioned deeper under the thorn cover. Two low vocalizations. Each behavior was observed by multiple witnesses, watching from inside the vehicles, each a step in an escalation sequence with a clear endpoint. The leopard told everyone in that convoy exactly what it was going to do. It told them in order, with pauses between each step. Marceau was the only one who didn't seem to be watching. When the lead guide's attention was briefly divided, Marceau opened his door and stepped out. He moved several meters toward the brush line, attempting to clear the thorn cover and reach a direct angle on the carcass. The geometry of what he walked into was the problem. The leopard was positioned between the carcass and the inside of the brush. Behind it was dense thorn cover with no exit. In front of it was a human being closing distance from the open side. A leopard in that configuration has one available response. I've walked that kind of terrain in daylight. Even then, even knowing what to look for, you don't see what's inside the brush until you're at the edge of it. Marceau walked toward it at night. The charge came from inside the brush at close range. The distance was short enough that there was no meaningful interval between the launch and the point of contact. The leopard made initial contact with Marceau's upper body and drove him to the ground, delivering sustained bite pressure to the throat and upper cervical region, consistent with the documented attack pattern across multiple incidents involving close human approach to feeding leopards. Armed staff intervened within seconds and forced the animal to release and retreat into cover. The response time was as fast as conditions allowed. Julien Marceau died from acute hemorrhage resulting from cervical vascular injuries sustained in the attack. He was pronounced dead before evacuation could be arranged. It was March 12, 2018, on the Rufiji River inside the Selous Game Reserve in southern Tanzania, where the wet season had raised the river to its widest reach of the year and flattened the surrounding floodplain into a gray-green expanse of water that stretched from the channel edge to the tree line in every direction. The Marsh family had traveled from Boston, Massachusetts. Daniel, 52, was an architect. His wife Rachel, 49, was a pediatrician. Their son Tyler, 24, had taken time between jobs to make the trip. His parents had offered it as a belated graduation gift. Their daughter Chloe, 20, was between university years. The river excursion had been arranged through the same licensed operator, managing their land-based game drives, and their guide, Johannes, held a valid river certification and carried a full safety kit aboard the flat-bottomed aluminum pontoon that served as the reserve's standard vessel for excursions on that stretch of the Rufiji. What Johannes had not completed before launching that morning was an advanced check on the pod's position along the eastern bend. The reserve's operating guidelines required this step following any significant water level change, and the river had peaked 3 weeks earlier. The hippopod that typically rested in the broad shallows of the eastern bend had shifted its position northward as the water moved, relocating to a resting site directly adjacent to the channel the boat would need to use to reach the downstream sandbank. Johannes had not run this route since before the river peaked. He did not know the pod had moved until the boat rounded the bend. The common hippopotamus is the third heaviest land animal on Earth. Adult bulls in the Selous Basin regularly exceed 3,500 pounds. In water, hippos do not swim in the conventional sense. They bound along the riverbed, covering distance with a submerged efficiency that does not read as movement from the surface until the animal is already alongside a vessel. Their territorial response in water is not graduated. A bull defending the pod's resting position does not issue warnings in sequence the way an elephant does. The charge is the warning. At approximately 8:20 in the morning, Johannes brought the pontoon around the eastern bend, and the pod came into view at less than 40 meters. Closer than he had anticipated, in a position he had not expected. He cut the engine immediately. The boat slowed, but continued to carry forward on its momentum. A large bull, positioned at the outer edge of the group, with his body angled toward the approaching vessel, submerged. Johannes had begun reversing the engine when the bull came up beneath the port side of the hull. The impact drove the near side of the pontoon upward and rolled it hard to starboard. Chloe and Tyler, seated on the port bench, went into the river on the first contact. Daniel caught the starboard rail. Rachel was thrown against the engine housing before going over the side. Johannes held position at the tiller as the boat settled, listing sharply but not fully capsized, and reached for the emergency radio. I think what makes a hippo attack in open water different from almost any other encounter in this series is that the water removes the variable most people instinctively rely on in a crisis: the ability to move. On land, even in the worst cases described here, there is ground, there is direction. In a river at depth, with an agitated pod occupying the shallows in every direction, there is only the surface and whatever you can keep hold of. The pontoon gave Daniel a rail to grip. Rachel, Tyler, and Chloe had the river. The bull surfaced and made a second pass at the hull, striking it from the side as Johannes attempted to bring the bow around. The impact drove Daniel clear of the rail. The pod, agitated by the sustained disruption on the water's surface, moved as a group. A cow, positioned between her calf and the open channel, turned toward the nearest movement in the water. Tyler was the closest. Rachel and Tyler did not survive. Their bodies were recovered by wildlife rangers who reached the scene 48 minutes after Johannes' emergency call reached the reserve's dispatch. Daniel was airlifted with a fractured pelvis and deep lacerations sustained when the bull's second strike threw him from the boat. Chloe was pulled from the water by Johannes using the emergency throw line and survived with a dislocated shoulder and significant soft tissue injuries from the capsize. Johannes was uninjured. The investigation confirmed that Johannes had not completed the pre-departure position check on the pod before entering the eastern bend, a step mandated by reserve operating guidelines following any significant water level change. The pod had followed the flood peak and had not returned to its previous position. The channel the boat used had become, without advanced reconnaissance, a direct approach through the pod's resting territory. It was the afternoon of March 14, 2017, aboard the luxury cruise ship during a private charter crossing between Martinique and St. Lucia. The vessel had been booked for a wedding party of 38 guests, celebrating the marriage of Solange and Renaud Marcelin. Solange Marcelin was 27 years old and worked as a junior accounts coordinator at a shipping import company in Fort-de-France, Martinique. At work, she was precise and detail-oriented. Outside the office, she was impulsive, physically confident, and constantly chasing content for her social media accounts. Friends described her as athletic and fearless, someone who treated every vacation like a production shoot. She had left the wedding reception still in her gown. The ceremony had taken place on shore that morning, and the group had boarded the ship immediately afterward for a celebratory crossing. Solange had been photographing everything since before the ceremony began. By mid-afternoon, she had already climbed onto a lower deck railing twice for photos while guests watched nervously. Both times Renaud pulled her down. Both times she laughed it off. I want to pause here because this detail matters more than it seems. Renaud wasn't being overprotective. He was reading the situation correctly, and she already knew that, which is why she laughed instead of arguing. The idea that had been building all day finally came out around 3:00 p.m. She told a group of friends she wanted a Titanic photo, but better. Not just standing on the railing with her arms out. She wanted to be lifted. The plan was for Renaud to stand behind her on the railing and hold her up by the waist while she extended her arms outward and leaned forward over the water. She wanted height, movement, and the ocean behind her. She had seen a version of it online and had been thinking about it since boarding. Renaud refused immediately. Solange found a cousin willing to help instead. The two of them climbed onto the outer railing of the observation deck near the stern, while guests gathered around them with phones raised. The railing stood just over 4 feet high. Solange climbed above it and positioned herself on the narrow exterior ledge in her wedding gown and heels, while her cousin gripped the railing behind her. The ship was moving through moderate open water, with wind gusts around 25 miles per hour. The deck surface was damp from sea spray. She extended both arms outward and leaned forward. That's when the ship passed through a wave swell at that moment, and the deck tilted. Solange shifted her weight to compensate, and her heel caught the wet metal edge wrong. Her cousin grabbed for her, but could not hold her. She went forward, over the railing, and fell from the observation deck into the ocean below. The drop was approximately 55 feet. A jagged metal drainage bracket protruded from the hull several feet below the railing. Solange struck it on the way down, opening a deep laceration across her left side before she hit the water. The impact of the fall itself caused further injury on entry. Blood spread rapidly through the surrounding water. Oceanic white-tip sharks are acutely sensitive to blood in open water and can detect it across significant distances. One reached her before rescue boats were deployed. It tore through her legs and her hands. Crew members threw locator lines and triggered the man overboard alarm within seconds. Rescue boats were deployed within minutes, but lost visual contact with Solange quickly in the ship's wake and rough surface conditions, and recovered only fragments of fabric from the water. Her body was recovered 2 days later. The recovered remains showed multiple traumatic injuries, though investigators could not determine precisely which occurred during the fall, and which resulted from subsequent marine activity. The condition of the remains was consistent with open water shark scavenging. The condition of the remains was consistent with post-mortem marine scavenging. Her body was repatriated to Martinique. Renaud was hospitalized for 10 days following her death. The medical examiner recorded her cause of death as drowning and traumatic injuries consistent with a fall from height, with subsequent marine activity noted as a contributing factor. Investigators concluded the incident resulted entirely from a passenger voluntarily climbing over a safety barrier. No citations were issued against the vessel. It was August 14, 2017, on the southwestern fringe of the Serengeti. For Selena Mero, the day began with an argument about camp rules and a sun that hadn't yet finished setting. She had no idea that the real cost was still days away. Selena Mero had built a small following, by reviewing restaurants across Southeast Asia and coastal Australia through short, contemptuous videos on YouTube. A travel outlet had commissioned her for a piece on safari camp food, the gap between what operators advertised and what actually arrived on the plate. She had called the pitch Safari Theater. She flew into Arusha on August 11th and reached the camp by land on the 13th. By the evening of her first full day, it looked like the Karen in her was already coming in hot. She had argued twice with the camp manager, once about dinner service timing, once about the prohibition on personal food inside tents. She considered the policy performative. That night she brought 3 protein bars, dried mango, and a sealed container of mixed nuts into her tent. In a message sent to a friend at 6:42 p.m., she described it as a small act of protest. Staff had repositioned and relatched all food storage bins that afternoon. 2 separate guests had reported lion tracks in the dry watercourse before sunset. Lions are not common immediately adjacent to tented camps in this corridor, but they are not unknown. A male lion averages 400 pounds, a female 280. Their canine teeth apply over 1,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. They can tear through heavy canvas with a single claw hook. The camp also sat along a known game trail used by migrating wildebeest and zebra during dry periods, which occasionally brought predators closer to human structures after dark. The senior guide, Festus, who had worked that corridor for 9 years, conducted a walkthrough of the tent row at roughly 5:15 p.m. and spoke to at least 2 guests about keeping tent flaps fully sealed and zipped. He did not speak to Selena. Her tent light was on when he passed, but he was immediately shooed away when she heard him walking closer. Footage from a camp exterior camera showed a single female lion entering the camp perimeter from the dry watercourse side at 6:51 p.m. Her movement was slow and cautious, stopping multiple times to look toward nearby tents and listen. She moved low, shoulders rolling, head extended, and was nearly silent. Investigators later believed the lion had likely been following scent trails from improperly discarded cooking scraps near the staff preparation area earlier that evening, and Selena's occupied tent was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The lion lingered around the outer edge of camp for several minutes before approaching Selena's tent. The first contact is audible before it is visible, a heavy inhalation, then the sudden rip of canvas as a claw hooked through the tent wall just above Selena's sleeping pad. She shouted twice, sharp and rising. She opened the inner flap outward, and immediately the lion's head filled the opening. What followed is partially captured on 2 separate recordings and took under 2 minutes. Selena was pulled forward, her shoulder wedging against the tent frame. The lion appeared startled once Selena began screaming, but continued swiping and biting during the confusion at the tent entrance. She was bitten a minimum of 4 times, the right forearm, the left hand, a deep raking bite across her ribs. But the 5th bite, a sustained clamp to the lateral neck, severed her right carotid artery. Other guests began throwing boots, water bottles, and a folding camp chair. Festus arrived with a flare gun at approximately the 90-second mark and discharged it twice skyward. The lion flinched, but did not immediately release. The lion dragged her another 3 feet before the second flare caused it to back away. Selena remained on the ground. Medical staff arrived 25 minutes later and found no vital signs. Her funeral was a sparse affair in her hometown of Perth, attended by a few bewildered relatives. Selena's death wasn't a tragedy of wilderness. It was a tragedy of performance, where the real lion wasn't the one with teeth, but the one she'd been trying to starve in herself all along.